Hello, I'm Professor Congleton, and this is Econ 441, Public Economics at West Virginia University. And today we're going to talk about two different theories of deficit spending. One is you might call the benevolent theory, and it was actually originated by Frank Ramsay, the same person who invented Ramsay taxes. And this diagram, which I've drawn before starting the lecture, it characterizes the kind of thing that Ramsay has in mind. So first of all, let's talk about deficits. Okay, so what's a deficit? So governments raise funds to pay for all the services they provide, and government salaries and so forth. And the difference between the revenues that are collected in a given year and the amount spent in a given year is the deficit or surplus. Right, so if the revenues are greater than the expenditures, you run a surplus. If your revenues are less than the expenditures, then you run a deficit. Okay, and for much of the 20th century, governments ran modest surpluses, or were pretty close to being in balance, with revenues equal to expenditures, except during war years or in times of crisis. After the 1960s, generally speaking, governments ran deficits virtually all the time, and often had quite large deficits even when there did not appear to be anything that looked like a crisis. So one of the contributions of the Ramsay theory is it basically explains that period in the first half of the 20th century when budgets were roughly in balance, and they would be adjusted during times of crisis of one kind or another, so that during times of crisis, when for some reason there was an urgent need for government expenditures, taxes wouldn't be raised to the level required to finance those expenditures, but instead bonds would be sold on the international market. The money would be borrowed from other sources, from investors who would maybe use their money to otherwise invest in other kinds of bonds, or possibly in the private sector, or put their money into the banking system in one way or another, where it would go out to consumers and firms. So one of the things that happens with deficits is necessarily the quantity of funds that are available for all purposes, all the loans that potentially could be given out, a significant fraction of those potential loans go to the government instead of off to the private sector, either to firms or to individuals. So that's a concern to some extent. We'll talk about why it might be a concern in the second set of models. But in the Ramsay case, I think it's not as direct a problem. So if you remember, the Ramsay theory of optimal taxation was that the tax system should be designed to minimize excess burden. And excess burden was basically driven by the tax rates and the size of the quantity adjustments to take place in all the individual markets throughout the economy. And Ramsay figured out that if you had a steady rate of tax, rather than a high tax in one period and a low tax in another period, that the deadweight loss tended to be lower for that average tax than the combination of a low tax followed by a high tax. The excess burden generated by the high tax was large enough to more than offset the reduction in excess burden generated by the low tax. So on average, you're better off with a smooth series of tax rates rather than ones that jump around all the time to balance budgets. So if you imagine the course of government spending and deficits and so forth being basically a product of median voter types of decisions, and if we assume that we have a pre-existing tax system that itself is fairly stable, as recommended by Ramsay, then this picture would be an illustration of deficit finance in these sort of Ramsay circumstances. So if this line represents the feasible range of expenditures for the government under that tax system. So in the present period, it could spend all its revenue, plus it could borrow against the future, and in the limit, it could borrow all the money that would come in the future. And that would determine this point here, right, the maximum level of expenditures that's even potentially possible in period one. On the other hand, it could not tax at all in the first period and just raise all the money in the future, in which case it could tax future income and then have saved all the tax revenue here, can earn interest on it, and so have 1 plus R times the tax revenue being TY1 to spend here in the second period. Well, obviously, neither extremes is likely unless there is some kind of extreme crisis predicted for period two or existing or occurring in period one. And so the median voter naturally kind of trades off these possibilities and tries to reach the highest indifference curve from the combination of government services in the present and government services in the future, holding other aspects of his personal consumption steady, or you can imagine all those little adjustments taking place at the margin as income changes and possibly relative price changes in the private sector. But we're focused here on the public sector, so we're holding kind of all that stuff in the background, holding it constant in a sense. So the place of tangency on this curve was not at the place where income in the two periods were on the curve simultaneously, which is that point. So this curve naturally goes through y2 comma y1 because in a sense, if you just pay as you go, you would spend ty in one period and ty2 in the other period, and that's got to be a feasible point on the government opportunity set. This indifference curve here is the combination that maximizes utility, and it involves a deficit in the first period and a surplus in the second period. Okay, so notice that Ramsay's argument goes through without any macroeconomic considerations. It's just the way you deal with, you try to keep you keep your deadweight loss from the tax system at the minimum possible. And so there'll be some periods where income is lower than average, or simply acknowledged to be, or if income in the future is simply acknowledged to be larger than it is now because of economic growth. So in both those cases, you can justify some deficit spending in the present, and then running surpluses in the future to redeem the bonds, pay for the debt that you've incurred. And so in the Ramsay type story, generally speaking, governments run a balanced budget in the very long run. But in the short run, you might have deficits or surpluses depending on whether income is greater than required for the steady state portfolio of government services that you've been consuming or that the voters want, the majority of voters want, or not. Okay. So this I call the benevolent theory of government deficits. It's there because it's rational for it to be there at the level of consumers. And it's rational for individual consumers to favor this type of pattern as a way of minimizing the deadweight loss of the tax burden, which of course is partly each voter's own tax burden, and dealing with the timing of income associated with ups and downs in business cycles, or ups and downs in just personal consumption or personal income for one reason or another, having to do with innovation or changes in the mix of services being provided in the economy. All right, so I think you would have to say that Ramsay smoothing mix is not very controversial. It's consistent with maximizing social net benefit. So that norm, the maximized social net benefit norm, is being advanced by this form of deficit finance. But in general, this model doesn't predict that you get really high, significant deficits running every year, year in and year out. It could happen a bit in a Ramsay type model if you're expecting income to keep rising, because of technological advance, improvements in human capital and so forth, accumulation of regular capital. And so there could be some bias in favor of deficits simply because future income is considered to be larger than current income. And that would be independent of different tax rates you might use to finance services. But the big deficits would emerge only during times of crisis, and the rest of the time either you'd run small deficits or surpluses necessary to redeem all the bonds. And we can show how that's consistent with the median voter model with this diagram. Okay, I'm going to take a short break now. I'll leave the picture on the whiteboard for a few seconds after I leave the scene myself. And then I'm going to come back with another theory, and I'll draw the picture of the diagram that goes with that theory before turning on the camera so that it's on the screen. You don't have to watch me drawing the stuff. And I can also make it a little bit neater than when I'm trying to get it on the board quickly. Okay, so I'll be back in a minute. Okay, so this is part 2 of the lecture. You can notice that I've drawn a different picture, or at least I've got different labels there. I decided that I could use the Ramsay diagram as my point of departure to see what the issue was here. And so the part of the diagram in blue is basically the original Ramsay diagram with just with deficits there to kind of smooth out the taxes through time and minimize deadweight loss, or at least reduce it relative to what it would be if taxes were jumping around through time from high ones to low ones to keep the balance, keep the budget in perpetual balance every year. In red, or orangish red, I've put up a problem identified by James Buchanan, and I've put up a version of it that's in a paper written by Buchanan and Roback. In the period between when Ramsay was writing and the period in which Buchanan and Roback were writing, there's an idea worked out by Ramsay-Barro that deficits are in a sense irrelevant for macroeconomics because basically deficits today mean higher taxes tomorrow. Right? So his idea is that basically you're going to have to be kind of paying off that debt at some point. And if people think in the long run, and I think then they'll realize that current deficits are just future taxes. And they would choose the pattern of taxes that maximizes their own income, maximizes their net welfare, more or less in a slightly more complicated multi-dimensional diagram than we've got here with just 2 dimensions. But the idea would be basically they would optimize with respect to taxing, possibly shifting taxes in the future because of higher expected incomes, as we talked about in the first diagram. But deficits that you see in that environment would resemble the original Ramsay diagram, because basically the whole future course of taxes were kind of anticipated by today's voters, and because they were connected with future generations, they would basically create the tax system and the trajectory through time that would maximize their own welfare and that of their children and their children's children and so forth. So in Barro's model, generations were kind of closely linked to one another, and so parents thought of their own welfare and also their children's welfare more or less interchangeably. So it was as if the current generation would live forever, and they were well aware that they would have to service any debt that they accumulated and eventually pay it off. Okay, so the Barro update, in a sense, of the Ramsay principle was simply one that said, well, this type of trade-off, this kind of way of thinking about taxation through time might not be limited to, say, 5 or 10 years, which I think would be a kind of more realistic kind of planning horizon for most people, but rather extend off to forever. Okay, and that would imply that no mistakes would be made in terms of that scheme of taxation that would make people have regrets, after 10 years or something like that. Well, what Buchanan Roback argued is that, well, not everyone is linked across generations, right? Some people don't have children. Some people don't like their children. Some people just don't think about it much. They just assume the kids will be okay, they'll be doing fine in the future, and they more or less focus on their own well-being in the short run. So these are not necessarily terrible parents, they're just kind of parents who kind of release their children and assume they're going to make their own way and don't think much about it after that. So if this variation among parents exists, then these linkages between the current generation of taxpayers and voters and future generations of taxpayers and voters is weaker than Barro assumed. And therefore you don't get this infinite domain of planning when people think about deficit spending and the trajectory of future taxes. And this lack of connection, this lack of planning, implies that people on average, at least these relatively weakly connected folks, have a bias in favor of deficits. And because they can get services now without paying for them. In a sense, they're getting a discount because taxes are and part of the cost is being shifted to the future generation. And they aren't thinking much about how their decisions affect the future generation, and they just therefore prefer to do more deficit spending than the Ramsay type of voter would have, or than the Barro type of voter would have. And so you can see, if you have these orange or reddish-orange indifference curves, they intersect further down this budget line, more towards the low end, where all the expenditures are kind of loaded towards the present and away from future considerations. And you see the deficit, as I've drawn it, about doubles. Okay, now the doubling is just an accident of the diagram. I wouldn't take that too seriously. But the point is the deficit goes up, and it may go up a lot. And that's a problem, not necessarily for the current generation, who are enjoying lots of services, okay? But it's a problem for the future generation and for the future of a country or society, because it means that future generations are not going to be able to have as many public services, or they're going to basically lose their assessment of being creditworthy on international bond markets and not be able to borrow, in which case they will have to pay for services with higher taxes if they want them. And that will, of course, generate a much higher deadweight loss than if the current generation had thought about their welfare when they were making their own fiscal decisions. Now, I would argue that these orange indifference curves represent a relatively moderate person who is somewhat connected to future generations, but not as connected as assumed either in the Barro analysis or in the Ramsay analysis. Someone who was not connected at all would have indifference curves that were basically horizontal lines. They wouldn't care at all about the future, and they would be on the highest indifference curve would actually be one that was down this way. All right, so And so they would wind up wanting to be down here, really close to here, where they would just borrow everything they could against future tax revenues and spend it all on themselves while they were alive. Right, so G1 could be thought of as a Generation 1's tax, government service, tax and government service combination, and G2 could be thought of as the tax and service combination available to the future generations. Okay, so in terms of social net benefits, these guys are being underweighted, and these guys are being overweighted. And so the Ramsay type of argument in favor of deficits is no longer valid, right? You're not necessarily maximizing social net benefits for this generation, the next generation, and the ones beyond those two. Instead, you're kind of overemphasizing the current generation's welfare. So the other problem is the financial problem, right? Eventually, if you borrow too much money, the banks will stop loaning you money and ask you to repay. Okay, and that's basically true in the bond market too. If the bond markets think you're overspending relative to your future growth rates and future increases in tax revenue associated with that, they're going to realize there's a big risk of default. Governments do default on their bonds. This has happened very often in South America, for example, sometimes in Africa. And it's almost happened in a few European cases. And so when you stop being able to sell bonds into the bond market at reasonable interest rates, your options are kind of very limited. And that can cause tax rates to have to rise quite a bit if you're going to fund the service level that people are used to or have been demanding. In macroeconomic terms, the problem with that event would be, of course, higher taxes and reduced government spending, at least in a neo-Keynesian type model. It tends to lower GDP. And that requires even higher taxes to come up with the money to pay for the services because you don't have as large a tax base. So these kinds of problems can be very serious at the national level. And of course, at the national level, there are people inside the nation, and they can be made very much worse off when they get into these debt crises, which do happen in many parts of the world, not every year, but every few years in some cases. Okay, so if you think about the trajectory of deficits implied by this sort of model, you still get a crisis type response, right? So as this income level in the current period or for the current generation jumps around, and if you're holding the tax system more or less steady through time for reasons that are related to the Ramsay type of argument or simply custom, then you will expand when Y goes down. You'll expand the deficit, right? When you have a crisis like the 2008 financial crisis that went through for about a couple of years, about a decade ago, deficits would go up. Okay, but under this scenario, you wouldn't necessarily pay down the debt afterwards, trying to making up the difference for the surplus in this period. Although in some sense, eventually some future generation may have to do that. The current generation doesn't, right? Because it can keep shifting that debt forward. And so if you're in a connected, and Barro's argument is that basically if you're in a connected generations, say you're in a family with very good intergenerational connections, what Barro would argue is that the current generation would buy bonds and leave them to their children as an inheritance, and therefore they would have the money from the bonds to pay their future tax debts as they taxes as they are emerged, or just cash out the bonds and turn the money over to the government at that point. But for people who weren't as well connected or were in less wealthy families, they wouldn't have that inheritance to kind of carry them over, and they would be stuck with this higher tax burden in the future, which is the Buchanan Roback point, which is a microeconomic point rather than a macroeconomic point. So we would get the variation in deficits from shocks in current income, but we probably would not observe the surpluses, because the surpluses, if any ever emerge, would happen in the future generation's lifetime rather than in the current generation's lifetime. And so this would suggest that you would get more or less perpetual deficit spending that would go up and down, but always remain in the negative zone where the revenues coming in were smaller than the expenses going out. And this model accounts for the history in most Western countries, most democracies, after 1960, where deficits have been extremely commonplace and surpluses extremely rare. As we'll see in the next lecture, where I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of deficit finance in the US. So at this point, normally I'd stop and answer questions and comments, but since I can't see you or hear you, and you can't talk to me directly, I guess I'll just end the lecture here. If you have questions or comments, feel free to email them to me. I will, while traveling, try to look at the email at least once a day, and I should have time to answer questions, not really long ones. And also, if you have questions about your paper topics and things of that sort, feel free to send me a note. And again, I'll try to respond within 24 hours to your note. Just remember that Japan is 12 hours ahead of the US, so my time zone while traveling will be very strange compared to yours. So my 24 hours will be maybe effectively 36 hours, really, in terms of the overall turnaround. But anyway, that's all for this first part of the lectures on deficits. Next, we'll talk a little bit about the history, and we'll talk about ways to kind of try to solve deficit problems. Of course, this last model suggests that it might be quite hard, because it just may be hardwired into the way contemporary voters think about government services and taxes in the long run. In which case, it's just a property of the culture that we're living in. And probably not much we can do about it, except try to pass a constitutional amendment or something of that sort if we were really able to persuade enough people that this was a significant problem. So I'll see you in the next lecture.